So this roundtable that we are about to have will bring together climatologists, energy specialists, transition experts, and insurers to discuss one key word, strategy, not the theoretical one that we forget about. No, a concrete, dynamic version of it. And for that, I call on stage Jean-Michel SOUBEYROUX to come. You are Deputy Scientific Director of Climatology at Météo-France, so we can applaud him. We also have Catherine HALBWACHS, in charge of EDF's plan to adapt its nuclear and fossil-fired power plants. You can sit wherever you like. We have Bertrand, Director of MACIF's Property and Casualty business line, with a particular focus on climate-resilient living conditions, and David Marshall, Executive Director at the ADEME, working on the link between national foresight and concrete tools for businesses and local authorities. And we can all applaud you. So what I like to do to start conversations, I like to ask a very short question, a simple questions for each of you to get the bearings and to briefly introduce yourselves as well. At least we get some of your viewpoints, and online you can also answer this question. So here is my question. For a climate strategy to be credible and fair, what do you think is the first condition to be met? So I don't want a long answer. I want the first condition to meet for a climate strategy to be credible. Catherine HALBWACHS, it needs to be sustainable and shared. Okay, this is the tone, okay? I would say within the international context, it's that it's science-based. We use the IPCC reports, and it needs to be used and not contested. Bertrand, I will talk about climate consciousness if we want to adopt a strategy. And David Marshall, I want to say it needs to make sense on the territory so that it becomes, it's used and that it's coherent. Thank you. So Jean-Michel SOUBEYROUX, I want to start with you to set the scene. At Météo-France, you follow the evolution of climatic hazards. Which do you consider to be the most structuring for the future of cities? So we do work at Météo-France for 2 years on how do we characterize the climate for the track, so the reference warming trajectory and the trends for cities. So it's the continuity of what is being observed today and what cities have faced already, and that they need to increase and improve their answer. And we also have new risks. So I think the ones that we know and that there is a lot of action on is strong heats. Strong heats in a France of 4 degrees is quite different from what we know today. So the threshold of 50 degrees is starting to appear in our simulation, so it becomes possible. I know Paris, it's 42 degrees, the record is 46 in France, but it has consequences, especially for health. There is another topic, and it's been mentioned this morning. It's water. Water when it's in excess, so excessive rainfalls. How do we handle these flows? And the lack of water as well. And sometimes we have an excess and then a lack of water very quickly. So how do we move from one situation to another? Cities need water to refresh themselves, but do we really have water? And then we have emergent risks that are harder to consider. So the coastal erosion, It is something that is maybe not felt yet, but that will become a major issue after 2050. So it's hard to move lines because it's not as visible as others. We also have wildfires that are going to be more general. So we will need to handle this so that it becomes controlled. So maybe this is a clear message. And we need to cross-reference climate data with social indicators. Yes, we cannot only stick to climate hazards. We need to see how cities is concerned with these hazards, what is sensitive today and in the future, and not stay in a climate analysis that is not crossed with the needs of fields, stakeholders. There is an issue here that we work here on distant horizons. How do you ensure that these projections can be used today? So I want to bounce back on the questions that was asked from Marseille City. The average age of buildings in Paris is of 80 years. So France at 4 degrees in 2100 is something that we have in mind. So the infrastructures that we build today, we build them so that they are still here in 2100. So it takes time to build and to make cities evolve. And we need to warn citizens as well. Yes, I think there is here a very big challenge here on communication and to leverage all the stakeholders. When we called each other to prepare this symposium, you made me realize something simple, is that the future generation in 2100 is already here. It's already there. So it's for our children, our grandchildren. So it's not a virtual world, distant horizon. It's really tomorrow. Thank you, Jean-Michel. It's a conversation, so this is a first round, and then we will bounce back on each other's questions. So, Catherine HALBWACHS, I'm sorry, I can't manage to say your name. I'm very sorry. Catherine HALBWACHS. So you're in charge of an ambitious adaptation plan for EDF, the SEMA plan. In concrete terms, how is this plan structured and what does it allow to manage? So first of all, our mission is to create decarbonated energy 24/7, 365 days a year, and to produce decarbonated energy that can be piloted. So we work on the long term because we work on 250 to 2100, and we have this SEMA plan. It's to understand, evaluate, assess, and then act. And we have a weather department connected to all different labs in the field because the climate preoccupation and concern has started in the 90s, and we from there start and create scenarios based on the IPCC's scenarios. We take 3 scenarios from the IPCC's report. We work on the worst case scenarios, and then we have 19 climate models, and then we try to narrow it down to different sites. And then we assess the consequences of climate change and the future. And then we make decisions and we decide. We have several scenarios. we don't oppose the adaptation to mitigation. We see that when we take the most stressful scenarios and models, we have very strong adaptation scenarios. We should lie about it. It's very difficult to adapt, and it's difficult for large infrastructures ours. So this is SEMA. So SEMA also works on natural environments. Yes, because you must understand that production of electricity is linked to water. For each kilowatt of electricity, however how it's produced, there is water involved. From there, if we need electricity, we need water. If we need water, we need to preserve natural environments. There is no miracle. We can dream about it, but today the emergency is to protect natural environments and the fastest way possible. So nature-based solutions and also all the humid areas. We need to protect our forests. We were talking about future generations. We are the last generation of to see the Chambord forest as François Ier saw it. So we need to urgently protect our natural environments. And there is one key word that you mentioned when we talked together before this symposium, is the living together. Yes, it's very important because today in the studies that we carry, we realize that strong heat degrades the collective approach. When we work on working conditions, we also need to work on living conditions, on housing. So, buildings of rural areas is very old, not adapted at all, and this creates huge concerns. And there is this big question, so we need to think of tomorrow's working conditions and living conditions. And you also work with local authorities, yes? Because your power plants are not in cities, so how do you work with them? Yes, but thanks to our power plants, we have electricity here, so we are not within cities, in the city centers, but there is an obvious link, and behind the power plant we also have networks, whether they are transportation networks or distribution networks, and concerns are the same. I think that cities cannot forget about rural areas. They are all interdependent. And of course, when we talk about water, about energy, we see that we cannot only think each in our corner, and we need to think in our in a systemic point of view. Thanks, Catherine. We will get back to it later on.
So at the MACIF, you have a strong point. It's called livability. So the idea of living together, the French concept of vivre ensemble. Is it related? Yes. First of all, I would like to say I'm delighted to participate once again to this seminar, and I'm very happy to see that MACIF is participating in this event, because for us, climate change, we can see it daily, and it was mentioned by Météo-France with studies to try to analyze how we live in 2050, 2060. So we're happy to participate in the seminars and try to answer to your question. Why do I need to focus more on livability rather than insurabilities? We have to bring us to a collective responsibility. As the mayor of Paris said, we need to be fully mobilized, each and every one of us. We shouldn't wait 2 years before taking a decision. So we have to do it with livability. So as you mentioned, heat levels etc. All these elements lead us to think about how we will live, in which environment we will live in. So if we don't understand the concept of livability, if it's impossible to live in an area, we cannot insure this area. So obviously the work of the insurers is to guarantee that we can insure something. And it has to do with conditions and criteria. It's for all the insurers and not only the MACIF. It's important we can have to share the risks. It's a question for society because now we have a mechanism for the good insurance of the natural disasters. And in 1982, we have this mechanism which got established, and we actually can share the risks and share the costs. But we know that this mechanism is being jeopardized. We had a government who took very bold decisions. They are good enough for now, but they won't be enough for the coming years. So this is why the costs, we need to be aware of the costs, and we need to understand that we can be duly insured, but in the right conditions. I have a lot of questions, but I'll also talk about how to raise awareness, how we can be efficient enough. And you already talk about what you see on a daily basis. What do you see at the MACIF? We see the distress of people because the insurers have paid more and more, and we saw that we have a drought in 2022. It was even more, even harder than what we have in the previous years. And we then noticed that the policyholders were actually struggled because they realized that the houses were no longer could be insured. So we also have droughts in the Hauts-de-France in 2023. We have a lot of floods too, and it created really a trauma for policyholders, and that's we see when we have to declare a natural disaster. But we can see more and more of these events, and the role of insurers, including the MACIF. Well, we've been working on this for years, and our policyholders at one point they are facing this climate change, and we need to support them on the long term. We need to accompany them. It's a role that is not very well known, but we need to support and accompany them. We need to raise awareness among our policyholders so we can actually have a tailor-made support for these policyholders. It leads us back to the culture of risks, because we don't talk about this in France, do we? And this is very interesting, and this is why it's important to have the MACIF insurance company in the seminar. It's important we have the scientists, and we need to be aware of the risks. France, we can say, is not very familiar with this concept of risk, the culture of risk. And we need to accept the risk, but we cannot make these risks ours. We can't really understand the risk. It's important to have this culture of risks. It's important for everyone to understand what the risks are so we can prevent bad consequences to happen. And see Josel, for example, they've been working for years and years. But they pretty much here, the leaders, they're just here to tell us we shouldn't actually observe and consider, but we actually learn and get ready. And this is what we mean by culture of risks. We need to get ready for these risks, and we can support our policyholders so we can live better in a country which will see an increase by 4 degrees. And one final thing, you ask ourselves, what's going to happen in 75 years from now, in 2100? And actually, it's very interesting to say that people who are born in 2025 will be 25 years old by the time we reach 2050. We live in a completely different world. We need to be aware of this. We need to understand and we need to learn culture of risks is. If you go to David Marshall, you're the executive director of the ADEME, and you work on the national level, but also you are creating tools for municipalities, but pretty much for everyone, to be honest. I will not ask again the same question asked by Léo Dubois. And my first question, how can you reconcile the various scales, the various scopes? How do you work with so many levels at once? Well, the ADEME, the ADEME, is a founding agency and an agency of experts, and we draft scenarios. And we also talk about mitigation strategies. So we create scenarios, and the latest scenario is called Transition 2050. So we have 4 scenarios how we can be carbon neutral by 2050, and the question is how we can make sure that these national level scenarios based on the average kilometers per household, the average behavior of households. Well, we have 2 different approaches. First of all is what we do with this, because we have 4 scenarios are based on narratives, social narratives, may have some political flavor, but they can be fully implementable. And I saw how municipalities, villages used our scenarios to start a discussion, a debate locally. And it's also important to have a difference between these scenarios so we can have get out of these averages, because no one is an average person. Everyone has some specific data. We can say that you eat the average amount of meat. You eat different meat and you live differently. So the idea is to get out of this average data, and we can have the dispersion, the disparities. So talking about sectorial segregation, and also for industrial sectors, we created transition scenarios for huge sectors requiring a lot of energy, for example, sugar industry, the steel industry, and so we can have more precise narratives and to support transition. And we need to focus on our territories. They are very diverse, and carbon neutrality on a national level. Some it will be different based on region. Some region will not be able to achieve this carbon neutrality. So it has to do with how do we share the burden, how do we share the efforts. It's important to have some kind of coherence between these regions. And so we have the GPE also working in this way, are creating tools, and we have to go to add a bit of granularity in what we do. And when we talk about carbon neutrality, we need to consider all these. We need to consider all the regions and with their characteristics. And we have a tool called TET, a tool to support transition. We give you specific reference indicators. So obviously the national authorities still have room for maneuver, but thanks to this we can guarantee the coherence and the good coherence with the local tools and national level. And see that based on everything you have, all the mechanisms, all the programs and all the resources available on your website, and you can see that quite a lot of local authorities are lagging behind. They haven't started yet, or sometimes they go very slowly. So how can we help these authorities? How can you help them? How can make them understand they're not being diligent enough? So we have a lot of tools to see how we can give the necessary tools, the adequate tools to our authorities. So in the TET, so we count a lot of local authorities that are fully involved in this, so we can actually have an action plan, and we try to create new tools for companies for local authorities. For example, the companies, we have a tool called ACT, ACT, so they can actually have necessary tools to comply with the Paris agreements. We have more than 1,000 companies participating in ACT. And we also have other tools, as Diane talked about, the adaptation mission for the PNAC and how local authorities can adapt to climate change. And as an entry point, we present an entry point tool called TACT, T-A-C-E, T-A-C-T. We really want to anticipate the risks in climate change. So with this TACT tool, we can actually draft a scenario. So we have the scenario that we can actually adapt to the local context. We need to make sure we can count on the commitment of the local stakeholders. And we have very practical tools. And we have, like Fresh Town, Plus Fraîche Ma Ville, we have 45 adaptation measures for local authorities, so they can adapt to climate change in their perimeter. I need to share the comments written by Lilou. I'm 16 years old, I understand everything, it's not very technical, it's quite concrete, so thank you very much, it's quite a good idea. It's always great to receive such comments. Please, Lilou, keep on sending us messages, and we also have questions. I was wondering, and I try to get back to cities and towns. How do you work very concretely with towns and cities? I already asked you, Catherine, maybe you have something to add. How do we work with cities and towns? As I was saying, we have an interaction between cities and rural areas, and it's constant interaction. We guarantee production of electricity production, and we need to work on livability. Our job is to guarantee the good livability of regions, and it will only be possible if we adapt together. The efforts we'll do to adapt our tools will be pretty useless if the infrastructure, roads, bridges are not adapted, if we don't have water treatment. We really depend on infrastructure. You saw that during the pandemic, because when we close the schools and we need to have a power plant up and running. So do I keep my kids at home or do I come to work? So we know that everything's connected. And if at one point you need to take a decision that it's 30 degrees in a school and we have to close the schools, then we have to talk with the local authorities, cities, towns, and the territories, and we need to tell them, you have to adapt because we are all connected, and it's quite difficult. It's difficult to understand the dynamics because it's a bit scary because we have to work together. So we need to work on this narrative. The scientific narrative is fascinating but quite stress-inducing. So we need to work. We all have to work, and we all need to have the will to work together. And I understand that for a mayor of a small towns or a city, it's difficult to talk about the end of the world, but we need to have to bring positive point of view, and things will be different. And as Diane said, the temperature, the current temperature in Valence will be the same in Paris in the next 30 years. Things will be different, but we can adapt. We have to do this together. We can talk about this in rural areas, but also in cities and towns. Yes, anxiety-generating science is the key word. Yeah, I would like to add something to what you said. The idea for an insurance company is that tomorrow we have to cover all these risks, most notably in cities and towns. And the very first step is to understand these events, and we cannot do it by ourselves. And I really insist on this. How do we have our fair share of the efforts? It's very difficult to forecast. And you know
Et
that
notre
the world is
sensibilisation, elle passe, on
changing,
met un petit pas de côté et on essaye notamment avec des dispositifs.
we try
On a,
to
et je vais
have
citer
a
cette
broader picture.
expérimentation avec l'Université de La Rochelle, c'est un spectacle ou des conférences sur la mer qui monte.
So we have
Monte avec un chercheur et
shows
avec
and events
on arrive
about the
non
rising
pas
sea
à
levels
dédramatiser,
in La
mais
Rochelle,
par
for
là
example, and
à
we
faire en
can
sorte que oui,
actually.
le message qu'on doit passer, il passe mieux. Et
I'm not saying that
finalement
it's
ce
not
risque
serious,
plutôt
but
voilà,
we
on
try
adopte
to
pour
understand
s'adapter
to
finalement à
teach
ce
them
risque.
how we
Ça
can
passe par là.
adapt
Après,
to a
spécifiquement
risk,
sur les
and
villes,
this
vous, le
is how
sujet
we
qui
want to
nous
do it.
intéresse à la MACIF,
So, regarding
c'est une
cities,
composante,
what we are interested
et
in
les assureurs
at
plus
the
largement,
MACIF,
c'est le sujet de l'impact
and
sur la
most
santé.
globally all the insurance companies,
L'illustration sur les eaux
is
de chaleur
how
est
would
très
be
claire,
the
on le
impact
vit
on
aujourd'hui. Ça va s'amplifier,
the
c'est
health.
comment nous, on se
And
prépare là
what's
aussi avec les scientifiques sur comprendre quels sont les
going to
impacts
happen, and we're
sur
getting
la
ready
santé,
with
sur les risques
scientists, and we need to
cardiovasculaires, sur
understand
la
the
santé
impact on
mentale. Enfin, il y a
health,
beaucoup de
on
sujets aujourd'hui qui sont
cardiovascular
à notre
risks, on
disposition et comment
mental
nous, voilà,
health. We have a
on
lot
se
of
prépare
tools
aussi
at our
en tant
disposal, and we
qu'assureur
need to
voilà, à
understand
faire
how we
face
can get ready as an insurance company, how
à
we
ces
can
impacts du
cope
dérèglement climatique
with
sur la santé et
these
notamment en milieu urbain.
the consequences of this
Merci. Jean-Michel, si je provoque un
climate
petit peu, je
change.
dirais qu'à une
Yes,
époque,
thank you, Jean-Michel.
j'ai l'impression que la
It
science
may
nous amusait.
sound provocative,
Maintenant,
but I get the feeling that one point
quelque peu peur parce
science
qu'elle
was
nous donne des indicateurs, les bien
fascinating
possibles, les plus
and
lucides
beautiful,
possibles,
and
mais ça
now
fait peur.
it became scary because we have very concrete indicators now. It's scary, yes, while we're facing these changes and we don't have solutions. And unfortunately, we cannot let the scientists by themselves. And people may actually reject and ignore our points because it's not very interesting and very interesting to talk about the end of the world. But the world has changed and we need to think collectively about the changes. But if we go back to the world as it was 30 or 40 years ago, it was quite different. So change is permanent in our societies, and now we need to plan this evolution. But we now have good visibility because even the previous changes, we didn't have this visibility, so it's quite a difficult challenge. It's a collective one, but we need to do it. It's our challenge. We need to tackle it. And for scientists, our job is to try to raise awareness and to inform people. And the work we do at Météo-France and with all the scientists, we need to bring the necessary information in the neighborhoods, in the districts, to make sure that this information can be shared and checked with and can be adjusted with all these adaptation plans. For example, we are currently developing a web portal called Adrias Impact, as developed by Météo-France. So we have our own information, but we also receive some economic vulnerability data. It's important to take the right decisions. I wanted to ask a question to Valerie, but I want to ask you first. We don't have that many meteorological stations. Is it so difficult to have the stations? Because in the weather organization, we need a specific distance between the sensors, so we can have accurate measures. So in the city, for example, we have to rethink the way we install sensors. And it was based, first of all, we started to work on these meteorological tools for planes, but now we are working in cities and we need to have to develop new tools and to adapt our tools. And this is why we work on. A final question for everyone before we move on to the Q&A session for everyone online and in the room. Why is it so important to remind everyone that we need to have a more holistic approach, a systematic approach? Why is it important no longer to feel isolated and not create silos between our actions? We already answered, but maybe you can add something else. David and then Bertrand.
C'est vraiment un point qui me semble important pour mobiliser, puisque
I think it's absolutely essential to have the needed mobilization.
Mais en plus, elles se renforcent.
Mitigation and prevention are not the opposite. Actually, they go hand in hand. It's important to, we have to build dikes and keep on building dams, etc.
Faire de l'atténuation, pardon, sans prendre en compte le sujet de
when you
l'adaptation
want
de la traque.
to mitigation, we need to, important to have some tracking activities, etc., because we know that the forests are shrinking, and we need to count on to understand how much water we have in our territories. And I think the main idea behind this concept of adaptation, because if we say 2100 is very far, it's still very remote. It's very interesting for an elected representative to do something concrete. So adaptation is maybe more important than talking about the adaptation to climate change, because we know the CO2 is not bound by national borders. It's important to mobilize the population while talking about the local consequences of climate change, and talk about systems. And we need to talk about the unstable living conditions, because we have precarious populations, and we have surveys in Paris, and we know that when we talk about adaptation and the most severe consequences of climate change are felt in more popular areas and working class areas. So we see that we have a more severe impact on working classes. It's important to understand that. It's important for the population to understand this, and to understand that the working classes will be most heavily impacted. And we'll get back to the priorities, because we talk about the city of Reims, and we have modeling so we can understand where the weak points are. There's no surprises there. And we'll have another session, as presented, introduced by François Germain, and we'll talk about the climate justice. I really understand. Let me add something. We know that we is going to create what we call the climate gaps, and we have a scenario as created by the ONS, and we see that the gaps and the breakpoints happening in the society. Let me go back to this mitigation and prevention. It's important to be aware of climate change. And once again, let me go back to what Jean Jouzel said. It's nothing new for pretty much everyone in the room, but if we don't have mitigation measures, we cannot really. And among these potential experiments, we have experiments based on nature. We, as insurers, we compensate, we pay, and it's important to understand our environment, and we have measures to preserve and protect our environment, and not something that we consider to be destructive. It's important to experiment and to understand the good meaning and to have a concrete evidence of what we want to do to adapt our societies. Anything about the opposition between mitigation and prevention, how we can actually have a better narrative? I think it's important to talk about this, because we are focusing more and more on adaptation. So maybe we didn't talk that much, to be honest, about this, but maybe some cities worked on adaptation, but others didn't. So as Diane said, we talked about adaptation, adaptation, and now we are currently trying to find adaptation measures. And the question is, what about mitigation? Does it work or not? And we all have the air conditioners, so we use it. Well, it's good for adaptation, but it's not good for mitigation. But sometimes the heat is so extreme that we need air conditioners. So air conditioning. So you see, we are currently trying to find solutions, and it's important to review the solutions and to have a two-pronged approach, adaptation and mitigation. So if the adaptation is not well done, it's called misadaptation. Yeah, misadaptation. We can actually write a whole book. We have a series with various chapters just to talk about bad adaptation. So we went back to the systematic approach because we know that when we try to create silos, we have the housing authorities not paying attention to what the Ministry of Environment does, and leads to absurd results. So, for example, when you have a building, it's completely painted in black in the south of France, so it's a catastrophe. So, air conditioning still exists. It's something that should be just temporary, but it's been temporary for 25 years, you know. We just a temporary solution, actually 25 years later, the air conditioning is still there. So, a lot of things, a lot of examples in France. As soon as you start to have a systematic approach and you make everyone sit around the table, we avoid all the mistakes that are truly infuriating. And so we really promote this. We have choices to make. So, for example, surface of gardens is heavily regulated. And the very first thing we said is that we don't want to have like a freshly mown lawn. We want to have more natural gardens. So we have a systematic approach with a larger scope and a smaller scope. And we need to educate people. Do you have questions? Do we have hands? To ask a question. Yes, we have a hand. Yes, not an arm, it's a hand. All right, okay. My name is Michel Pascal. I work at the Ministry of the Ecology, and I'm the inspector for natural areas. So we have a discussion with the National Forest Authority, and I'm quite familiar with the environment, but I was surprised by they said the forest is burning more and more, but if we cannot support the adaptation, the forest will not be able to adapt because it's evolving very fast. So the National Forest Authority want to plant more trees, and they don't let the forest renew itself. So we talked about parks, we talked about the lawns, but do you want to plant something else rather than grass, or maybe something that on the long term, a long-term approach? So, for example, we have plant types of tree types that grow around Montpellier, the south of France. We have two parallel projects with the ADEME and the SERMA project is better, so we stopped at the ADEME because, you know, we talk about the operators and redundancies and the competencies overlapping. So we have the SERMA tool for this. I can't remember, I think it was called SESSION. Yes, it's called SESSION. And we try to select the best types to survive climate change in Paris.
I have one question online. Maybe it will be for you, David. So the regulatory power can end polluting actions in cities. So there are many examples, but I'm talking about labels stick to fruits and vegetables, for example. So on regulatory power of cities, does it allow cities to end some counterproductive practices, let's say?
Oui, enfin, je pense qu'après il y a un sujet de
Well,
domaine de
I think
compétences aussi.
there
Enfin,
is
chaque
also
niveau de collectivité, enfin, je sais pas
a
exactement
question
à quel
of
niveau vous situez cette question,
perimeter
mais chaque type de
and
collectivité
scope.
a quelque part des
Each
compétences sur lesquelles elle peut
authority
agir.
has
En l'occurrence, les
competences and
étiquettes
they
sur les
can
fruits et
act
légumes,
on
malheureusement,
some
relèvent pas vraiment de
competences
ce
and
niveau de
labels
compétence.
on fruits and
Mais
vegetables
oui,
does
elle
not
peut faire un
depend
certain
on
nombre de
cities,
choses
but
dans le
yes,
cadre de ses
there are
compétences ou
some
celles qu'elle a déléguées
actions that are
aux
possible
EPCI
within
ou aux
their
départements.
competences,
C'est le problème de
depending
compétences.
if they are
Raymond, je vous
an
invite éventuellement à préciser votre question
EPCI,
si
a
vous, si
municipality.
vous le
So
pouvez.
if you
Est-ce qu'il y a
have
une autre question ici dans la salle des fêtes?
more
Oui, il y a une
details
autre
that you
question. Oui.
need, maybe ask the
Bonjour.
question. Oh, there's
Bonjour.
another question.
Merci. Je vais parler en anglais parce que mon français n'est
I'm
pas
going
très
to speak in English.
My question is,
Ma question
amidst all these strategies for
concerne le fait
mitigation and
que
adaptation, I'm
toutes ces
wondering
stratégies
if there is
d'adaptation
an
et d'atténuation, je me
overarching
demande
message that can be conveyed to citizens, like what would be each of the participants' message that could be the most simple and very actionable, that citizens can understand and engage, because it's difficult to translate all the complex scientific message to like individuals don't feel like they have the power to do anything, so they would need maybe one objective, simple and clear, so they can really engage. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
S'engager.
Oui, et ça rejoint la question de
Merci
Linda
beaucoup.
justement en ligne
Oui,
sur est-ce qu'il y a comment expliquer le déni de certains
it's the
citoyens
same as
nombreux ou collectivités.
Linda's
Comment les
message
collectivités peuvent
online.
sensibiliser,
How can we
embarquer un
explain the
maximum?
denial
Ça,
of
c'est
some
toujours la
citizens
question
and how can
très
authorities
compliquée parce que
bring
le
people
sujet
with them?
complexe
It's
et
always a
comment
very
ne pas
difficult
simplifier non
question
plus.
because
Ouais,
how
je me
can we
permets, je passe
simplify a topic
précisément à la
that
question,
is
je m'en excuse, je vais
complex?
faire court.
So
Je suis surpris
I
des
will
fois,
try to be short
je suis
and
rassuré par
to
le courage
explain.
de certaines
Sometimes
villes
I am surprised and I am
qui engagent de
reassured
vraies
by the
stratégies
courage
locales
of some cities
d'adaptation et qui
who
n'ont pas
have
attendu le CNAC,
local
mais qui
strategies
participent
and they
et ça, faut les saluer. Ça
do
a été
these
évoqué
useful
ce matin, et je
initiatives.
pense qu'il y a beaucoup d'exemples autour de nous. Il
This
y a
has
des
been
villes qui
said
ont
this
pris à bras le
morning,
corps.
and I think some
Après, il y a
cities
des
have
villes qui
really
regardent ça un petit peu de
engaged
loin. Et là,
and
c'est pas
really
l'assureur qui
committed,
parle,
and
c'est le
some
citoyen.
cities are
Je constate
not
ma vue sur
yet
le recul du
committed,
trait de côte,
and
l'érosion du littoral.
I'm
Quand
saying
même
this
aujourd'hui,
as a
les
citizen
outils
and
sont mis
not
à
an insurer.
disposition.
If we look
On
at coastal
s'inscrit, les villes
erosion,
s'inscrivent dans un
they
certain
are
décret liste
tools
et elles ont des
today,
obligations mais
and
aussi des moyens.
cities
C'est-à-dire
today
pour
have
préparer, s'adapter
decrease
vis-à-vis
lists,
d'une
and they
stratégie
can
à 2030,
get
2050,
ready, get
2100.
prepared to
Pourquoi aujourd'hui ces villes-là, et c'est
prepare
une
for
réponse, pardon, qui
2030,
n'est pas forcément à
2050,
votre question, mais pourquoi
and I
aujourd'hui
don't know
on
why
n'arrive pas,
these
ces villes-là ne
cities
s'inscrivent pas
today
dans cette logique-là?
do
Qu'est-ce
not
qui fait que certaines ont bien compris?
use these
Et moi, j'ai pas la
tools?
réponse, hein,
Why
j'observe les choses.
did some
Certaines ont
city
compris, je vais vous
already
donner un
understand
exemple
this, and
à
why
Lyon.
did some
Je vais pas citer les villes,
not
mais
get
sur une
involved?
petite île
So I'm
charentaise,
not
ils ont
going
deux
to name
communes
any, but
proches, il y en a une qui est inscrite
some
dans le décret liste,
on
l'autre qui ne
an
l'est pas.
island
C'est
in
absurde.
Charente,
Et c'est là où les
one
citoyens, nous, on
city
doit,
is
je pense,
on the list
au-delà
and
vraiment
one is not, and I
c'est
do
pas
not
l'assureur à
understand
nouveau
that.
qui
This
parle,
is
c'est
absolutely
comment
absurd.
on sensibilise aussi nos
How
élus, comment
can
on a
we
conscience
raise
de tous ces
awareness
dispositifs réglementaires. Il y a
with
beaucoup
our
de pédagogie à faire,
representative?
de façon à ce que nous,
There
on
is a
soit une
lot
force
of teaching to do so that
constructive pour
we
dire, bah oui, mais
become
attention, là, mes
a
enfants, en
constructive
2050, voilà, ils auront
strength,
25 ans ou ils
because
auront
our
75 ans en
children
2100.
in
Et
2050
pardon de ne pas répondre à la
they
question.
will
Merci, mais je pense que vous avez
be
répondu sur
25
certains
in
points.
2050 or
Alors, de notre
75 in
expérience, nous, on fait énormément de
20 in
sciences
2100.
participatives. C'est-à-dire, dans
We
tous nos
do a
sites,
lot
on
of
accueille
participative
régulièrement des écoles,
science.
on fait énormément de
We
choses là-dessus,
welcome
et en particulier sur la nature.
schools
Et ce que nous,
regularly,
on peut
and in
dire
particular on
aujourd'hui,
nature.
c'est
What
qu'on
we
ne
can
protège
say
que ce qu'on
today is
connaît.
that we do
Et j'allais dire, même
only
on aime que ce
protect
qu'on
what
connaît.
we
Donc
know,
on a un
and we
énorme
only
travail pour aller
love
vers
what
des
we
choses que
know.
les
So
gens
there
aiment
is
et
huge
qu'ils
work to
connaissent.
do
Parce que sinon, ça reste
on bringing
abstrait
people
et
to
autres.
know
Donc,
more things.
on travaille
Otherwise, it
aujourd'hui, donc on
stays
cherche
quite
aussi
abstract.
des gens pour
So
porter des
today,
messages.
we are
La raison pour
looking
laquelle
for
on
people who
travaille
carry
énormément avec le domaine
messages.
de
This is
Chambord,
why we
avec
work
Fontainebleau, avec l'ONF,
with,
pour
for
dire
example,
pourquoi
the
la
Chambord
production nucléaire
Castle,
s'intéresse à Chambord.
Fontainebleau,
On a une
the
centrale juste à côté,
ONF.
c'est vrai, mais pas que. Pourquoi?
We
Parce
do
que le
have a
message,
power
c'est
plant
que tout le monde
next
un
to
jour
Chambord,
rêvé
but
d'être princesse
what
ou
is
chevalier,
important is that
ou quelque chose comme ça. C'est un côté
one
magique.
day
Mais si on veut voir les moulins
everyone
Chambord,
wanted to be a
il
prince
faut
or a
absolument
princess.
qu'on s'adapte.
But
Et il faut qu'on adapte aussi Chambord.
if you
Discussion
want
avec
to
les architectes
get into
nantais,
Chambord,
monuments
we
historiques.
need to
Néanmoins, il faut qu'on
adapt.
s'adapte, il faut qu'on adapte la forêt et qu'on atténue. Ce
We
discours-là,
need
il
to
est
adapt
portable
forest
parce
and we need
que,
to
alors, on a un
mitigate.
discours
And
qui
this
est
is something
brutal,
that
qui est de
people
dire,
can really
voilà,
take into
François
their
Ier avait
hands.
l'Italie en 2050,
So
l'Italie est là.
François Ier dreamed of Italy at some point, and Italy happened. And it's the same as the forest today. It's something that is relatable. We need to adapt. We need to bring people to like and to love things. Otherwise, we won't make it. David, yes? Maybe in just a nutshell, because many actions can be done by individuals. We have a tool called Our Climate Gestures, and you can do your own carbon balance in just a few clicks. And I think it's something that is quite coherent, so that people can realize what actions can they undertake on housing, on how they move, etc., and how they eat. And it really takes 10 minutes, and at least people can get to know what they consume, and carbon balance is a real topic at the moment. But how can we convince a company to make their carbon balance? So some are compulsory. There are some things that are compulsory, yes, but today with the ecological backlash, we see that there is a risk of legal regulations. For example, the CSRD that is going to change, and the ACT tool that I was mentioning earlier on, we see as well that there is a backlash there.
Ouais, c'est clairement des mauvais signaux qui ont été renvoyés. Sur la
These are bad signals that we have had on the CSRD. For many, it was a big constraint, and now it goes beyond this. It allows to raise awareness and to be able to contribute to mitigate this carbon impact, and we need this regulatory framework. We see that if we don't have that, we move slower, and with big companies as well and their slow ecosystems. Jean-Michel, for ecological backlash, you think there is a scientific backlash as well? How can we make this voice be heard? Science here in this constant noise, whereas it's the one that we need to hear. It is a challenge indeed. The scientific word is contested, so it needs to be of a high level. This leads to high quality expectations, but let's not be naive. We need to be in debates. I admire Valéry Masson a lot for his fights and his battles on social networks, for example. So we need to convince people as well to explain, re-explain again science. All of us have a superpower. As soon as we are on social networks, we can share what we hear. You can share the actions, what you hear here today. It really is a superpower today. Please use it to propose intelligence and to spread intelligence on social networks. Do you have questions? We can take one or two. So if you raise your hand with the smartphone to take a picture, maybe we can confuse this with a question. So here, sir, yes. It's not really a question, but the round table brings a lot of reflections. I will try to be short. I am Jean-Michel Deroux. I work in science, and honestly, what you say about science is terrifying. You say that it is scary, but it's not. When you are sick, for example, you're scared until you know what it is. Even when you're sick, for example, you go to see a doctor, they will tell you what it is. So we need to know what it is so that we are not scared. And I'm not sure citizens are questioning science. I think that, yes, we have social networks that we need to explore and use more. But I think at policy level, there is a questioning of science, and maybe this is linked to economic factors. And I know that we will have a roundtable on economic factors. On science, let's not destroy science. I think science is beautiful, and I think citizens think that science is beautiful. I think this is what we need to carry as a message. And on systems, as technologists, we need to talk about systems. But at citizens level, we need very concrete actions, because if we don't reach citizens, then we won't make it. It's not really a question, but it's a comment more so. I think everyone likes science here. I hear what you say, but it's not what we said. I think in the answers we gave, there is no questioning of science. I will talk for myself. I think that, at the contrary, without science, we won't know. It's not stress creating. We do understand what is going to happen, and we see how tomorrow we can integrate these elements. And if scientists did not work on several trajectories, we wouldn't be able to talk about it. And I think, at the contrary, scientists have a role and have not been heard. And I think this type of event do put value into what you scientists, researchers did do until now. And many structures work within the world. And I think this event, at the contrary, really puts forward all the work of scientists. We will take the two questions at the same time.
Allez-y, monsieur.
I have a question. We have stakeholders here of scientific organization, of businesses, but we do miss the state. And what is the part of lobbying to move things quickly, because we are in the crisis context with the state cutting finances to local authorities. So what are the chances to make it in this difficult context? We will also take the second one. And we have the state here represented by the ADEME.
Alors, bonjour, Manon Pelas, chargée d'affaires publiques.
My name is Manon Pelas. I work for DELIGNON. My question is on local authorities. Mr. DELIGNON, you talked about the difference of commitment between the different authorities, local authorities, and how sometimes it could be explained. I want to talk about regulatory tools here. You've talked about the PCAP, for example. In the past, I've observed that the PCAIT is reviewed every 3 to 5 years, and that there are a lot of changes because it is subject to the city's policy depending on the political mandate, and we have noticed this break in commitment. So how can we continue and keep the continuity of these regulatory documents of adaptation through the different political mandates that can be different? So I want a short answer, please, David.
J'aurais tendance à dire que c'est l'articulation de tous les documents de planification qui
I think it's using all the planification tools that will give coherence, because we have the SCOT, the strategy, we have many different documents with different deadlines.
C'est en ça que je disais tout à l'heure que
this is why I was saying earlier that we try, and we've been trying since the SGPE work. It's easier to say that we have a national trajectory and this is how we can put it into action at regional level, but each region can have the capacity to do how they want. But this is what we need to achieve. The state does not should not work instead of local authorities, but it should give some framing elements so that the ambition stays at the right level. We don't always realize that we need to sometimes apply these national trajectories at regional level.
Alors juste un mot. Ouais, mais vraiment, non.
Just one word.
La question, c'est sur le financement. Moi,
To the first question on funding.
On s'accorde tous là-dessus. Il faut sanctuariser certains
I just want
et notamment ceux de
us
la prévention,
all to
qui a été
agree
évoqué sur le fonds
on
Barnier.
prevention, especially
Je pense que c'est important.
on the Barnier Fund.
C'est vraiment important.
We will mention it later on, but we need that the budgetary element is considered at the highest level, and it is something that is difficult to talk about. And the last word will be from Fleur, who said to support Mr. Leroux's word, we need to have a systemic approach.
Et une toute dernière question.
So we need to conciliate the systemic approach and the debate approach. So, and one last question, yes.
Et c'est David qui vous donne le micro. Et j'annonce en régie, on va dépasser de quelques minutes. Et alors,
we will be a bit behind in terms of time, but I want to react because I think the question that was asked is very legitimate on constraint. We are not in an era when it's easy to add legally binding measures. We do have some in the national policy on adaptation to climate change for businesses, for example, for transportation businesses, for energy businesses. They must have a vulnerability study and to adapt their plan to climate change. This will be true for all operators of vital interest as from next year, and employers will have to have prevention measures in case of a yellow alert heat wave. This is an example of legally binding elements. When we talk about the reference warming trajectory, we talked about the PCAET. The interest of integrating the TRAAC in the environmental code is that when there is a change in the frame, we can talk about the track and say, when you do this PCAET, this study must take into account the track. So it is a very important side of it. There is a change here in paradigm in comparison to what we used to have, and I will be quick. And secondly, on funding, because it is something that is important and we need to have important budget. The amounts are quite high. Today, in the state's budget, there is not a line saying adaptation, and it's normal because adaptation needs to be in all the different lines, not just ecology. It must be on all fields. It can be in real estate, management, in justice, for prisons, health, everywhere. Today,
les grandes masses qu'on peut identifier pour le budget 2025, c'est à peu près 1 milliard
for 2025 budget,
1
with
milliard
1.5 billion,
de l'eau, 300
including
millions
1 billion
pour le
for
Barnier, qui a été
water
augmenté de
agencies,
30% cette année. via
100
le fonds
million
vert, via le fonds
for
pour
the
les
Barnier
PCAET,
Fund,
ça fait environ
for the
1,5 milliard. Mais en fait, il y a
PCAET,
beaucoup d'autres
that's
actions
about
qui sont via
1.5 billion,
les
but there are
politiques
many other
immobilières,
actions
via tout ce
in
qui est
real
entretien
estate
également.
policies,
Mais
maintenance.
pour mobiliser ces financements,
But
ce qui est
to
important
leverage
aussi,
this
c'est de
funding,
faire en
what we
sorte que
need
tous les nouveaux
is to
investissements
make sure that
qui soient
all
décidés
new
aujourd'hui
investments
prennent en compte directement l'adaptation au
made
changement
today
climatique.
take
Puisque
into
on sait
account
que les
adaptation
bâtiments
to
qui sont
climate
construits
change, because we
aujourd'hui,
know that
ils vont
buildings built
durer
today
80 ans.
will last
Donc on va pas les
80
démolir.
years.
Donc il faut que dès aujourd'hui, on sait que le
We're not going to
surcoût
demolish
pour
them.
construire un
So
bâtiment qui est résilient, c'est de
the
l'ordre de 5% à
overcosts
peu près.
today
Il faut que ce soit
are
intégré dès
of
le départ. Quand on
5%
décide
to
d'une
build
rénovation,
a resilient
le
building.
surcoût pour avoir une
This
rénovation
needs
qui
to
est
be
résiliente
integrated.
au
To
changement
have
climatique, c'est
a
10%.
resilient
Il faut que ce soit intégré dès le
renovation
départ,
is
à chaque fois
10%.
dans
This needs
les,
to
dans
be
les, dans les
integrated
budgets.
from the
Et ce qui est
start
important aussi,
in the
c'est
budget.
ce qu'on ne finance pas. Et
And
ça,
what
c'est
is
aussi
important
quelque
is
chose
what we
qui
do
est,
not
qui est très
fund.
fort dans notre plan, c'est le fait que
It's very strong in our
de
plan as
financer
well,
des
is
choses
that
qui ne
we
sont
need
pas
to
résilientes. Et
stop
notamment en ce qui concerne les aides aux entreprises.
financing and
On a
funding
actuellement
things that
une
are not
revue, une
resilient.
mission d'inspection qui revoit toutes les
We
aides aux
have a
entreprises
review
pour se
at
poser
the
la question
moment,
de
reviewing
pour telles aides,
businesses
il faut
to
qu'on ait des
see
critères adaptation
which
et qu'on n'ait plus 1 euro d'argent public qui aille financer des choses
help
qui ne sont pas
can go to adaptation strategies.
À vous, chers participants.
I'm
Merci
sorry
d'avoir
for
joué le jeu cet
hacking
échange.
your
On fait
session.
une pause de 10
Thank
minutes.
you very much.
10 minutes.
We will have a
le temps de prendre
10-minute
un café,
break
et on se retrouve pour
for
parler
coffee.
financement. Merci.
And we will gather to talk about funding.